One.
Welcome to the 5th edition of the DILAX Lab. I'm very happy that you tuned in today. Before we start with the actual lab, I want to say just a few words about the organization of today's lab. So this is a webinar which takes around 30 minutes. And if you have questions, do not hesitate to just write them in the chat in the questions and answer part, or to write an email to webinar@dilax.com. So I'm very happy that you tuned in today to the DILAX Lab. This is a platform where we talk to professionals from the industry of city development, public transport, and the retail sector. And today we have a very special guest in-house, which is Suzanne Hoadley from the POLIS Network. Hi, welcome, Susan.
Hello, thank you. Good to be here.
Yes. So Suzanne is a manager and a coordinator for traffic efficiency at the POLIS Network. So if you're facilitating the knowledge transfer and all topics regarding sustainable mobility between the POLIS members. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So what else could you say, Suzanne, about your role at POLIS and the POLIS Network itself?
Okay, so POLIS, as you mentioned, is a network of city and regional authorities. So we have now close to 90 members from across Europe and also beyond. And essentially, we are, as a network, we are about facilitating networking between our members on, topical transport matters. But we work very much on transport innovation and sustainable mobility. And we're also very heavily involved in research and innovation projects at European level.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. So before we start now with the topic, I also want to say a few words again about DILAX. So DILAX is a provider of data in public mobility and in the city development and retail sector. So we have sensors that we install, so either in buildings or in vehicles, for example, to gather data on how many people enter and exit vehicles, for instance. We get this data, we gather this data, and we also display them and analyze them in the different software products that we have. We do this since 1988, so since over 30 years now, and we are active in 1,800 cities around the world. So some of your members also, for instance, Paris or Helsinki or Dresden, for example. So today's topic is on sustainable mobility and is called Transformation for the Future of Cities. So Suzanne, before we get very deep into the topic, so how do you define sustainable mobility, or how do your members define it?
Okay, well, I think sustainable mobility is a means to enable cities to achieve their overarching goal of a livable city, which is what citizens want. They want to be in a livable city. And sustainable mobility is quite a broad term. It has many goals and elements that make it up. They include greener transport, so more environmentally friendly transport, cleaner air, safer roads, more efficient mobility, and I put the emphasis on efficient mobility as opposed to efficient traffic, because at the end of the day, we want efficient movement of people, of goods, not just efficient movement of cars on our network. And of course, there is a strong social dimension to sustainable mobility as well. So we want more inclusive transport and more affordable transport so that we can achieve transport equity. Modal shift from the car, especially single occupancy vehicles, to public transport, walking and cycling is really key to achieving sustainable mobility.
Yeah, so it seems logic to me. And so how would you define the role of public mobility in particular regarding the sustainable mobility movement?
Yeah. So, public mobility or public transport, I would say, I think that's, I guess the priorities today for public transport specifically are really about greening the fleet, so moving away from fossil fuels, and these are obviously key priorities at European level in the European Green Deal and European Recovery Plan. But a second important priority is really to try and make public transport more attractive to its users. So how do cities try to achieve that? Well, many ways. But I've sort of grouped them into, I guess, two main groups of measures. The first is really the physical and the digital integration of public transport. So integrating different public transport modes, but also their integration with other modes. So at the physical level, we have what are called these multimodal hubs, where we have, at a physical site, we will have different modes coming together. And the aim is to enable this sort of seamless transfer from one mode to another. So if you're in a bus, you arrive at a stop. When you get off that stop, then you have other modes there at your disposal for you to take your onward journey. So it could be scooter, taxis, or a shared bike scheme. There's been a lot of attention to a lot of effort to integrate information, to enable improved pre-trip journey planning, and also on the payment side as well. So integrated payment schemes through, for instance, smart cards, but also other types of digital payment schemes like near-field communication. And also there is a growing interest in these mass apps. And I think the second group of measures that are being implemented to really try and make public transport attractive is to increase the commercial or the operational speed of buses in particular. Yeah. So to reduce delay. And for that, we see a lot of road space being reserved for buses. So, for instance, bus lanes, and also systems being implemented at traffic lights to give priority to the bus. So as a bus is approaching a traffic light, if the green light is on, then that will be extended. If the red light is on, then that will switch to green a lot faster. So I'd say these are the two main groups of measures to really promote public transport.
Okay, that sounds very interesting, and also reflects what I'm talking to our clients about. So especially the topic on punctuality of buses is something that we talk about with the authorities every day, actually. Yeah. So could you name some examples of cities or some measures that have been implemented to give a more clearer example for our audience?
Well, I think the examples that I gave are already widely implemented, I think, in many cities using different systems. I think if we move on to the topic more of intelligent mobility, which I think is something that you're particularly interested in, and there we have a strong sort of data dimension. Data is very, very, very topical today. Data is the new gold. That's what they say, and certainly within the POLIS network and amongst my colleagues, data is a priority across different transport domains. I mean, the domain that I coordinate within POLIS, it's traffic management, ITS. Of course, data is fundamental, but across in other areas like urban logistics, micromobility, road safety, data is very very important, and data is very much linked to the, data activities are linked to the smart city strategies of that many cities have, where we're seeing data lakes being created in cities like Paris and Rotterdam, or integrated data platforms like they have in Lisbon, where there are more than 300 data sets from across the administration that are brought into one platform. So you have a much better strategy tool to know what's going on, and also to support operations. But I think if we, data is very important, but it's not just about having data and data tools. But in my view, it's really about having the capacity to work with that data, to take advantage of that data. So I think that's really that's really important, and there are lots of good examples out there. Just recently I was involved in a study where we interviewed a number of cities around Europe about sort of data sharing, data acquisition, and generally the data strategies they were they were building. And I had the opportunity of the cities and the public transport agencies that I interviewed. One came to mind, and that was the Brussels public transport operator, STIB, which is really working on building up its internal capacity. And, they recruited a data expert a few years ago, not a transport expert, a data expert. And a big part of the job of this person has been to convince the management of the usefulness of the benefit of data analysis, data visualization tools. And they have some great examples of how they've used data analysis to get better insight to the organization and the operations, and also to improve efficiency. I can mention a few if we have time, but yeah.
I think this was already very valuable and also reflects what the approach of DILAX is, obviously, since we do not only gather the data but also analyze it and also integrate data that is available for the public transport authorities or for the cities, so to create a data hub to get it together and to really make decisions that are based on facts.
Yeah. So I can mention a few if you like. I think some of the stuff that STIB has done, I think, is quite fascinating, and I think it's always good to provide examples. So, for instance, so the Brussels public transport operator, they've used data analysis, for instance, to try and understand, to see if there are any patterns in buses breaking down. So once they'd done the data analysis, they found that the buses that were prone to breaking down were those buses that tend to be used on those routes where you have steep roads. So that was a really useful finding. And then what did they do? So then they introduced a bus rotation strategy within the organization to make sure that it's not always the same buses that are on those most challenging routes. And as well, they use data analysis to support with the performance monitoring of ticketing machines. So ticketing machines, they can break down. And before, normally it's the supplier of the ticketing machine that's notified when a machine breaks down, and then the supplier informs the operator or the authority. And now, just by looking at the ticket sales, and, if there's a drop in ticket sales at a given time, then that can sort of raise alarm bells. Okay, maybe there is a problem with this machine. And then you can call a member of staff at the station and go and check. Yeah. So, and the latest thing they're doing, which I find fascinating, is they're really using data analysis to inform the rollout strategy of their electric buses. So they're sort of incrementally implementing or deploying these electric buses, and they're sort of using data analysis to inform that rollout strategy. So it's all, there's huge potential from data analysis.
Completely, and it also goes into the direction of predictive maintenance, as you said. For the ticket data. You also came up with the term ITS, so maybe you want to explain it to our audience, what you mean by that and how you're working on that.
Okay, so intelligent transport systems, I don't know if there is an agreed definition, but it's essentially, I think, ICT applied to transport. I think originally it was very much about taking, where it originally came from was, say, 20 years ago when I joined POLIS 25 years ago. And it came from really, there are cities and public agencies use a lot of systems to manage transport. And especially in the area of managing traffic, we have systems, we have traffic lights, we have adaptive traffic lights, we have other types of system, we have cameras, and all these systems generate a lot of data. And this data was not really being reused. So it was used for the purpose of, the managing the traffic or monitoring the traffic, but there was that it wasn't really being used other than that. And that's when this data was starting to be put into, information services to drivers and then to other types of travelers were developed on the back of that data. But I think today now it's a term that's used more loosely to mean any sort of system that relies on information communication technology. Whether it's to manage the fleet, to manage the roads, to provide information to users, to some of the systems that you're actually selling as a company that you introduced at the start of this session.
Yeah, so any type of technology that is useful for the whole system.
Yeah, information and communication based, of course. Yeah.
Okay, I understand. So if we have a look at the current situation of the pandemic going on, what long-term impact of COVID-19 do you see in the cities that you're working on, especially with regards to resilience?
Okay, within POLIS, we facilitated a lot of discussion amongst our members during the first lockdown, especially because this was something that was really unprecedented, and we were just reacting day by day. But I think, what we saw at the beginning was there was this, of course, massive reduction in trips by car and public transport because we had to stay at home, and that was sort of compensated by growth in walking and cycling, and this led cities to repurpose road space. I mean, we had to give more road space to cyclists, we had to give more road space to street space to pedestrians, especially to maintain this sort of physical distances. And what was quite interesting was that some of our members said, okay, we're putting in place these measures, mainly these infrastructure adaptations, but we would have, they were part of our sustainable urban mobility plan. So COVID has simply accelerated the implementation of measures that we were planning to take in any case. Now, it remains to be seen now which of those, let's say, infrastructure adaptations, these new cycling lanes, widened footpaths and the like, which of those measures will remain permanent. Quite a few of our members have said they want them to become permanent, but we know that there has been pressure in some cities for some of these infrastructure measures to be removed. So this is sort of still ongoing. Now, in terms of, what will be the real impact of the pandemic and how is it going to affect mobility, I guess we won't really know until we're fully out of lockdown and we're really starting to live with the virus. We don't know what our transport needs are going to be. We're assuming that many of us will continue to work from home at least part-time, so there'll be less commuting traffic, but there could be more local travel demand that's, spread out through the day. We don't know, if there is going to be, will all public transport passengers come back to public transport? Will there be an increase in car use? Certainly between the first and the second lockdown in many cities, they did see a growth in car traffic because people were fearful. Hopefully, once we get the virus under control, people will be more reassured. But certainly, the cities are hoping that this growth in walking and cycling will be maintained. And just on that matter, I just wanted to mention that there has been a new guide it's a SUMP guide on resilience in transport. So SUMP is a big program of the European Commission, Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning, and that was actually released today or yesterday. So if you're interested in obtaining that, please visit the POLIS website or contact me.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, it is a little bit looking into the future where we don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. That is true. We all hope that there's still some benefits from it in the future. But yeah, these are already some starting points to use the lanes which are not used as much due to home office, for example.
Yeah.
There is also a study that you've been working on for the past weeks, months, of which I know, together with UITP and EMTA, where, as if I could recall correctly, you analyzed different parts of the mobility and transport sector in the different cities and got the feedback from the members, and also a broader look, also an economic look on the different modes of transportations that are being used or could be are on the market right now in terms of sustainable mobility. And you were also analyzing the impact of mobility as a service, so the mass mobility, of which there are, as we figured out already in our previous conversations, there are different definitions of mass. So it could be the providers and the app providers of, for instance, these vehicle, the bikes or the scooters that you can rent. But it could also be just the on-demand service that you get out of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, mass is one of those terms, as you rightly said, that's interpreted very differently depending on who you talk to. I mean, there is some people have a very big definition. I guess myself, it's more really about the digital integration of those services. So not the actual physical production or the offering itself, but it's really about integrating them digitally and then packaging those to users. I think that's the more purist definition of mobility as a service. And yes, you're right. We issued an opinion last week, so a joint opinion between POLIS, UITP, and EMTA, which is an association of passenger transport authorities. And we produced this opinion because, I guess, in anticipation of European regulation it's called European Regulation on Integrated Ticketing, and what it will involve is an obligation to open ticketing systems to enable third parties to sell those tickets. So essentially, it means that a transport operator will have to build some sort of ticketing API to enable a mass platform or a mass app provider to sell those tickets. And so this is something that we expect to happen in the coming years, and the Commission is working on this at the moment with many stakeholders. And I guess one of the concerns that we have is, then there has to be some sort of governance of this ecosystem. There have to be some minimal rules. And what we want to ensure is that mass, it supports sustainable mobility goals. I mean, that is how it's promoted at the moment, about integrating all these different goals and different modes and supporting sustainable mobility. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you are a mass app provider selling we are worried that, as a public authority, we are promoting or we're prioritizing public transport, walking and cycling. And these are the sort of modes that are very difficult to monetize, at least walking and cycling. It's very difficult to make money from selling a walking trip or a cycling trip because there's no money to be made there free of charge. And public transport is a service that's sort of low profit margin. So it's very little income to be made from that. So I guess we're a bit concerned that once we have in the future, when we may have lots of commercial mass providers, that they may be inclined to promote those modes where there is the highest income potential. So for instance, car sharing or taxis or ride hailing. And of course, these are legitimate modes of transport, but we don't want to see this shift from sustainable modes to car-based modes at the end of the day. So this is something we're a bit concerned about. So this is why we're saying that, public authorities need to have some sort of oversight of these of the mass ecosystem, and they should have the authority to decide. I mean, what sort of tickets, if we talk about a public transport operator or a public transport authority, they should be able to decide which sort of tickets should be sold, bearing in mind that the ticketing system in cities is very complex. We have many different types of fares, discounted fares, and it's very difficult to open up all those type of ticketing arrangements through an API. So what we're saying as well is that, it should be up to the public authority to decide what sort of tickets can be sold and also at what price they should be sold. Because if public authority subsidizes public transport services, so we want to be sure that subsidy reaches the users of that services.
Yeah. In the previous DILAX Labs, some of the statements or some of the recommendations were also that public transport would be for free. Then, it's one step to using it more. Maybe also as part of the sustainable mobility, obviously. But yes, it is a complicated topic, and I know that it is very different from also one country to another, from one city to another. But having this in mind, and since there's many authorities amongst our audience, what would be your recommendation to the city planners and authorities having this potential conflict of mass in mind and generally regarding sustainable mobility?
Well, I guess, the opinion that we produced, that was really, as I said, in anticipation of European regulation. But I think it's really important to work collaboratively with the different modal operators within your cities, and to start engaging with those sort of, the mass platform providers. I mean, just to be open and just to think about, what is it you want to achieve as a city, and how can you achieve that, and how can you use new concepts, new technologies to achieve that. But we will, it's quite the governance of the ecosystem is quite a vague, nebulous concept, and we want to try and dig into that a bit further, with our members, but also with the wider public. So we will be organising an event towards the end of March, where we're very keen on engaging with the wider stakeholder, mass stakeholder community, about sort of our expectations from mass and the roles and responsibilities within the mass ecosystem. Digitalization is good, digital platforms can be good, but if we look to other sectors, and other platforms like Airbnb and Booking.com, there are some winners, but there are also some losers. With Airbnb, the customers are very happy. Those renting their properties through Airbnb are very happy, but those people who live in cities where Airbnb is very big, and where landlords find it more lucrative to let out their properties through Airbnb than rather than to local people, then these local people have, rents go up in price. There is scarcity of rental property. So that's when the public sector has to come in to regulate, because otherwise it makes life very, very difficult for the people who live in the city.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah.
And let's all think about it. Unfortunately, this was already my last question, since we are already quite advanced in time. However, I would like to ask maybe one or two questions from the audience. So one of the questions is, what actors are part of the Intelligent Mobility Network? What new cooperations are you seeing?
Well, I think I guess it depends what we mean by intelligent mobility. If we go back to what we were discussing earlier on, that, intelligent means sort of data or data driven. I think it's evolving all the time. But what some work I did quite recently that I mentioned before, I mean, what we are starting to see are more data integrators and more aggregators. Mm-hmm. And new types of tools, data visualization tools, which are becoming, I think there's growing interest amongst public authorities in these data visualization tools, because they can, if we take a dashboard, for example, which is a typical visualization tool, they can, they can convey complex sets of information in an easy to understand form, whether that's for people within the administration or for people outside the administration. I mean, just a few weeks ago, Transport for London released what it called the road collision dashboard, where it had taken all its data about road collisions over the previous years and put it into a dashboard that was just, you look at it and within 10 minutes you've understood, you get the real gist of what the road safety situation is in London.
Yes, then question is still what to do next with it, but it is a good thing to do so, to have a status quo and to visualize it. Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Maybe one last question. What change will have the biggest impact on public transport? What do you think? It's your own opinion, I would say.
The biggest change in public transport. That's a big question. I think public transport has to be safeguarded. Public transport is considered has a special status in European law, and I do hope that will be preserved. I do worry that with the arrival of mass, we are entering an era of transport service commoditization, where we're buying and selling services. And while that approach might be okay for some modes, I think for public transport, it deserves special treatment, and I do hope that it will continue to be, because of the public service value that it's delivering in terms of accessibility and transport equity. I mean, that is just so important. But I think there will be a push to improve efficiency of public transport, and maybe to combine public transport more with more sort of on-demand public transport services, so more sort of vehicles and services that are adapted to the needs of a given area. So I think we're certainly going to be, going in that direction.
Yes, that could be. Thank you very much, Suzanne. I think we touched a very broad spectrum of topics today, and I thank you very much for your interesting insight. I hope, you liked it too. As an audience for the next DILAX Lab, you can tune in again in March. And if you have questions, comments, recommendations, or if you want to be part of the next DILAX Lab, don't hesitate to send an email to webinar@dilax.com. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you for the opportunity. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.